Good morning, everybody. Welcome. It's so great to see so many of you here and so many of our friends and colleagues. My name is Anne Cleveland. I'm the executive director of the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity here at UC Berkeley, the proud home of the AI Security Initiative, and with the Citrus Policy Lab, the AI Policy Hub. CLTC, the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity, works to look at the future of cybersecurity and to expand who participates in cybersecurity. And I can't think of any program more emblematic of that mission than the AI Policy Hub. We're so pleased to be celebrating the second cohort of AI Policy Fellows today, and I'm personally really excited to hear these talks. Before I introduce our next speaker, I'd like to give a special thanks to our distinguished faculty advisory board for the AI Policy Hub and to the two keynote speakers that we have today, Ken Goldberg and Niloufar Salehi. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Jessica Newman, Director of the AI Security Initiative at CLTC and Co-Director of the AI Policy Hub with Brandy Noneke at the Citrus Policy Lab. Well before ChatGPT was a household name, Jess saw that an interdisciplinary AI policy hub was needed to anticipate and address AI policy opportunities in places where expertise was scarce. And through her leadership, she made that a reality. And now it's grown into this incredible community that's contributing cutting-edge research and is the next generation of bridge builders between AI technology and AI policy. Folks will be leaders in the field of AI governance and safe and beneficial AI for years to come. So congrats to the 2023-2024 AI Policy Fellows, and please welcome Jessica Newman.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Anne, and hi, everyone. We are so thrilled to welcome you all here to UC Berkeley for our second annual AI Policy Research Symposium. Thanks for making it out on a Friday morning. This event is organized by the UC Berkeley AI Policy Hub, which I am honored to co-direct alongside Brandy Noneke, an associate research professor at the Goldman School of Public Policy and the director of the Citrus Policy Lab. She's really sorry not to be with us today, but was truly instrumental in the planning of this event and in all that we do. So Brandy and I dreamed up the AI Policy Hub back in 2021 when we were beginning to see the capabilities of AI technologies really ramp up, but when many companies were actually cutting their responsible AI teams and trust and safety teams. And we knew there was so much more work to do to be able to ensure that these AI systems could be developed responsibly, to see that as many people as possible could experience the benefits, but that the development and use of AI systems were not going to cause significant harms to people, communities, and society in the process. We know UC Berkeley has unparalleled talent in AI across so many different disciplines, departments, and centers, and we are honored to collaborate with many of them. Our vision for the AI Policy Hub was that we could create a space on campus to take people out of their academic silos and provide a meaningful support for research into some of the thorniest AI policy challenges. We select annual cohorts of UC Berkeley graduate students following a competitive application process and provide these students with research fellowships for a full academic year. The cohort then has the opportunity to not just further their own research, but to learn from peers with different expertise and to benefit from hands-on training workshops, speaker series, and other events. The fellows learn the skills to translate their academic work for policymakers and other decision makers, and are well positioned to move into impactful careers in the AI policy field. The AI Policy Hub benefits from being jointly housed at the AI Security Initiative, part of the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity, and at the Citrus Policy Lab, which is part of the Center for Information Technology Research in the Interest of Society and the Banatao Institute, or Citrus. We also have an incredible advisory board for the AI Policy Hub, and I want to take a moment to thank all the people that you see on the screen here for their support and guidance of this program. Professors Hani Farid, Ken Goldberg, Sonia Katyal, Deirdre Mulligan, Ziad Obermeyer, Stuart Russell, Niloufar Salehi, Pamela Samuelson, Ben Yu, and Andrew Reddy. Thank you for bringing your expertise from across different departments and centers on campus. We're really grateful for all that you do. And here are the 6 UC Berkeley PhD students who are our second annual cohort and have been part of the AI Policy Hub since last fall. They've all done incredible work in the AI Policy Hub, and we're really excited you'll have the opportunity to hear from them today and learn about their important research and advocacy efforts. I'm also excited to announce that we have opened up the applications for next year's cohort. So if you are a current UC Berkeley graduate student and you think you would benefit from this opportunity, please check out our website at cltc.berkeley.edu/AI Policy Hub and submit your application by Tuesday, May 14th. All right, let's move on to the agenda for the symposium today. You've now heard a little bit about the UC Berkeley AI Policy Hub, and please feel free to reach out to me if you want to learn more. Next, we are honored to have an opening keynote presentation from Professor Niloufar Salehi. We will then have a series of lightning talks from the 6 AI Policy Hub fellows. These are going to be broken down into 3 categories: evaluation and auditing, responsible use, and accountability for harms. Each of these categories will have 2 presentations that will speak to different components of the topics. We'll then have a final keynote presentation from Professor Ken Goldberg. After that, we're hoping to have a little time for audience Q&A, so please hold your questions until the end, and we'll have the chance to raise your hand and we'll bring a mic over to you. We have a lot of fantastic content to get through today, so if we're not able to get to everyone's questions, please stick around afterwards or follow up with us by email. So let's get it started. All right, it is my great honor to introduce our first keynote speaker. Niloufar Salehi is an assistant professor in the School of Information at UC Berkeley. She studies human-computer interaction with her research spanning education to healthcare to restorative justice. Her research interests are social computing, human-centered AI, and more broadly, human-computer interaction. Her work has been published and received awards in premier venues, including ACM and CHI, and has been covered in VentureBeat, Wired, and The Guardian. She's a WT Grant Foundation Scholar for her work on promoting equity in student assignment algorithms, and is a member of the advisory board on generative AI at NVIDIA. Professor Salehi, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. I think over the past 2 years, being part of the AI Policy Hub has been really a highlight of being at Berkeley. I think we have so many open questions when it comes to AI and society and policy, and I don't think that it's at all possible to even start to approach them if we don't take this interdisciplinary approach that Jessica and Brandy and all the folks at AI Policy Hub have been so good at really cultivating here. So today I'm going to sort of bring my approach to it. I was trained as a computer scientist. My research falls into human-computer interaction, and I'm going to talk about what I see the contributions or the approach that kind of approach can bring to these really thorny questions of AI policy. And I'm going to start by talking about something that probably is top of mind for you as well. It has been for me over the past few years, and that is, how on earth are people supposed to be relying on systems that fail in unpredictable ways? So I'm going to start with an example of that. So imagine that you are a doctor and you just got back your patient's lab results and you have this urgent message that you need to get to them, which is, please hold your kidney medicine until you've had a chance to speak to your kidney doctor. Now there's a problem here, there's a challenge, and that is that you only speak English and your patient only speaks Mandarin. So you put that text into Google Translate and you get this text back. Assuming that you don't actually read Chinese, I want you to think about whether you would give this translation to your patient or not. Let's do a show of hands. Who would hand over the translation to their patient? So like half a person. 2 halves of one people, so like one person. Who would not hand this translation over to their patient? So most of the room. Can we hear from one person who said that they would, what their reasoning is? Yes.
Yeah, I've put stuff in Google Translate before, and when you reverse it back, it's completely random, and I've had people who, speak other languages tell me just flat out that it's not only the practical purposes, but for information sensitive with this, no.
So that's great. So based off of past experiences, it sounds like you would not give the translation to your patient. Correct. Who, out of the two half people who said that they would, what is your reasoning?
Maybe better than nothing.
Better than nothing, right? Yes.
I think assuming the person has the medicine,
Uh-huh.
the medicine has a really bad effect.
Yes.
That might be risk mitigation. I would want to do that. Take the risk of the translation and ensure that this medicine that she has doesn't store.
That's great. You're giving my talk for me. So yes. So what is the alternative is a really important question. What are the risks, and what are the risks that it can go either way? I will say that whenever I give this example to a more technical audience, especially people who have been thinking about ethical machine learning and policy, this is almost always the response. No one wants to give the translation to their patient. I will say that we've done a large-scale study across different clinical settings in California, from really big hospitals to really small clinics. This was work published in Fact 2 years ago. Basically, every single person we spoke to was using Google Translate to communicate with patients who don't speak English. And I think that's a really important thing to keep in our minds, is what is happening on the ground as doctors are making these cost-benefit analyses. What is the risk of this being an incorrect translation versus what is the potential risk of this person not getting this information in time? The other flip side of that is what the first person mentioned, which was past experiences. So when we are making these risk-benefit analyses, we're really relying on my past experiences with Google Translate or other things that I've heard from other people to make this risk-benefit analysis. And that is not a really great place to be in. So I will say that this, I kind of tricked you. This is a sentence where the meaning gets flipped, at least in 2019 with Google Translate. It turned into keep taking your kidney medicine until you've had a chance to speak to your kidney doctor. This is a real sentence. So my colleague and collaborator, Elaine Kung, is an emergency room doctor at UCSF. She has a lot of patients who don't speak English. When you're in an emergency room, you are usually, obviously, very short on time. So you don't necessarily have the time to bring in an interpreter. A lot of the times, you're also discharging patients who are perhaps not fully well yet. And so the instructions that you send them home with are very, very important. There are basically, most of the time, vast majority of the time, those instructions are only given to patients in English. And there's research that shows that if it is in a language that they understand, they have better outcomes across the board. And so what my colleague, Dr. Elaine Kung, has been doing is actually putting her instructions through Google Translate, copy-pasting them back into the instructions with a little disclaimer that says, this was translated with Google Translate. And so she ran this study. She took actually real emergency room discharge instructions from UCSF, ran them through Google Translate, and did this evaluation study. This is one of the sentences that was in one of the discharge instructions that led to a potentially life-threatening error. I will say that the error rates were very high. So something around 8% of the sentences translated from English to Chinese were incorrect, such that they carried clinically significant harm. That's a really, really high error rate that I was very surprised by when I heard it, because my experiences of Google Translate have been very good. So when I was traveling in Mexico, I was translating a menu. It worked great. And I think that's one of the things that is so hard here, is that the way that we think about how tools work and the way that we generalize just does not work with these stochastic systems. And so we need to be doing a lot more there. From an HCI standpoint, I see two problems with this interaction. The first is that it's really, really hard to identify errors. The interface looks exactly the same in these two scenarios. One, I'm in Mexico translating a menu from Spanish to English, two very high resource languages, very simple task, very high accuracy, versus I'm in an emergency room, I'm translating doctor's instructions from English to Farsi, very difficult task, very weird language, very low resource language. And the interface looks exactly the same. And that's a really big problem. So this makes it hard to identify errors. It also makes it really hard because there are no actionable strategies to recover from errors. And you might be thinking, what has that got to do with policy? We cannot make good policy if we don't have good ways to evaluate and guide people on how to use systems. Because a lot of what we do end up doing when we're making policy for systems that don't always work, like medications, diagnostic tools, other kinds of things, is that we provide guidelines for professionals and experts who are using those tools. And if we don't have good ways to create guidelines, we don't have good ways to create good policy. I'll give you one more example. So imagine that you were summoned to jury duty and you are presented with this evidence. So I'm not sure how small it is for the people in the back of the room, so I'm just going to read over it. And I want you to think about, if you were in the jury's shoes, would you think that this evidence is strong enough to convict the defendant or not? So the evidence is this. The software analysis concluded that it was 695,000 times more probable that the DNA sample originated from the defendant and an unknown unrelated person than from two unknown unrelated persons. The analysis also found that it was 133 times more likely that the DNA sample originated from the defendant and the complainant than from the complainant and from an unknown unrelated person. You might be thinking, that's crazy. There's no way they would actually show that to a jury. This is actually real text from a case in 2018 that was shown to a jury in New York. So let's do another show of hands. Who thinks that this evidence is strong enough to convict the defendant? So maybe about 10 people. Who thinks it's not strong enough? So about the same number of people. I will say that this is a case that was reported in ProPublica. It's a real case. This is real evidence that was shown to a jury. This is a case where the person was initially convicted and later appealed. The case was appealed by their lawyer and they were acquitted based off of the same evidence. This is an example out of research by one of my PhD students, Angela Jin, who's sitting there, who is also an AI Policy Hub member. My point with these examples is that reliability when it comes to AI models is really, really important. In some cases, it's life or death important. And also it's really, really hard. And we can't really make progress on it unless we go at it from all fronts at the same time. So why do we end up with these systems that work in these weird ways? I really like showing this XKCD figure because I think it really simplifies. Of course, it's an oversimplification of what actually happens, but basically the person is saying, so this is your machine learning system, and they're like, yeah, you just pour your data into this big pile of linear algebra and then collect the answers on the other side. And then they're like, but what if the answers are wrong? And the answer is, well, just stir the pile until they start looking right. This is, of course, an oversimplification, but I really like bringing this up to really set the stage on like what we're trying to achieve here. Designing reliable human AI interactions is really hard. It's a big part of policy. There are technical things that make it hard, like uncertainty around capabilities, output complexity, and unpredictable behavior in different conditions. There are human factors that make it hard, like expectation violation. We tend to develop these expectations of how something will work. And when those expectations are violated, we tend to overcorrect. And that's why you see these papers that seem to be finding contradictory things around over-reliance or under-reliance on AI. We also have a tendency to overgeneralize, and we have a lot of cognitive biases. To resolve that, we've been doing a lot of work in my lab. I'm just going to mention it really quickly. We've been working on ways to guide appropriate use of models. So how do we evaluate model outputs? How do we help people craft good inputs to models? How do we support community values? So how do we help people understand what are the values embedded in a system? How do we properly evaluate a system? And finally, sometimes these systems cause harm. And in that case, we need to understand, we need to have a good understanding of what do we do when a system causes harm? Or sort of justice approach would say, figure out who's been harmed, what are their needs, and whose obligation is it to meet those needs and work to repair the harm. And I'm so glad that we have amazing students who are going to tell you a lot more about evaluation and repair from harm today. Future work, I think, on a policy level, we need to be really, really thinking about design for AI reliability. How can we develop? I think we need some kinds of hybrid systems that have some form of a machine learning model together with some external sources of verifiable information so that we can have that groundedness and that reliability. And I think we need to do a ton more work on evaluation. I think we're in the very, very early days of understanding how do we actually evaluate that pile of linear algebra for these really high stakes real world situations. So with that, I am super excited to hand it off to our students who've been doing amazing work on this. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much for that excellent presentation, Niloufar. Your work is so important and does set the stage perfectly for our next set of talks, which will explore different avenues of AI evaluation and auditing. So being able to investigate the AI models that are in use is absolutely critical so that we have greater transparency into what models are actually in use, how they might fail under different circumstances, and how those failures might impact different communities. So I am excited to introduce our next two speakers. First, we will hear from Guru Vamsi Polichaila, or Vamsi, and then from Christian Ikioku. Vamsi is a computer science PhD student at UC Berkeley, advised by Sanjam Garg. Vamsi's project focuses on verifiable proofs that an AI system is robust, fair, valid, and reliable. And Christian is a PhD student in EECS, advised by Christian Borgs and Jennifer Chase. His project is helping develop algorithms to teach AI general safety meta-principles that it can apply in specific contexts so that AI safety mechanisms are able to generalize to inputs that are vastly different from the distribution it was initially trained with. So thanks so much both, and Vamsi, over to you.
So my research sort of focuses around how you would actually enforce AI regulation that's sort of been coming up. And, everybody agrees more or less that we really need regulation around AI systems and nobody should be deploying them haphazardly. But it's very unclear how you actually are sure that, people are actually regulation compliant, right? In particular, let's say you're interacting with ChatGPT, right? And maybe a regulator looked at the model because you're not allowed to look at it. And they said, okay, I certify that this is compliant. But how can you actually be sure that the model that was certified is actually being used, right? OpenAI could have actually just swapped out that model for something completely different and said, oh, this is actually what was certified, but maybe you're getting something completely different. And finally, we would like to really do this without violating the privacy of the model or the data set, because very often the model contains sensitive information about users, maybe even healthcare data or tax information, right? And, you really want all of these guarantees without compromising any privacy. So I want to argue in this one slide that auditors are actually completely insufficient for this problem, unlike in the financial setting. So let's say you have the server, right? It has this data set and this model. What happens if you went and deployed AI regulation, right? So what's going to happen is the server is going to have to send over all of its information to an auditor. And what that auditor is actually going to have to do is retrain the entire model, because they can't really be sure that this data is what corresponds to this model. And then once they can confirm that, they're going to say, okay, this model satisfies whatever properties that I care about. And now I'm going to give you some certificate that you can maybe display on your website, right? And then later when a client comes online and says, oh, I want an inference for this query, you send it over. And the only thing they have to, sort of trust that you did all of this regulation compliance is, okay, you have the certificate on your website, right? But, you can really use a different model here. There's nothing, tying the inferences to the models. And this becomes really important when, let's say, this model was used to determine what interest rate you get for your housing loan, right? Or maybe you're using it to, figure out who gets the job. And to solve this problem, what we've used is zero-knowledge proofs, which is sort of a tool in cryptography. And I'm going to tell you what it is at a very high level. So in zero-knowledge proofs, there's like a prover and a verifier. And think of there being a sum function f, and there's some output of this function x, right? So the prover is going to convince the verifier that they know an input w to this function such that the output is x. And importantly, f could be pretty much any function that you could think of. So imagine it being like the ML training function, and you could prove whatever properties that you want about the ML model and so on through this function f. So this proof pi that the prover sends over to the verifier to convince him of that fact is also going to be zero knowledge. What that means is you don't learn any information beyond what is revealed by x. So you don't know anything about w, but you're convinced that they know some w. And finally, there's soundness, which means a prover who doesn't actually know a valid w is not going to be able to do this. So what would happen if you were actually given zero-knowledge proofs in the context of AI regulation, right? So what we're going to do is completely get rid of this auditor. We really don't like him. And also there's like a lot of incentives that don't really land because the server is paying the auditor to do this audit. Then, how do you really trust them? And instead, the server is just going to generate what's known as a proof of training all by itself. And we actually implemented this. And what this proof of training is going to say is, hey, I took this data set and I actually trained on this data set to arrive at this model, but you're not going to reveal the model or the data set. That sounds like magic, but that's what cryptography lets you do. And then later, you're going to additionally give a proof of inference, which says, okay, I actually used that data set, where I proved all the nice properties. And that's what I'm also using to give you your inferences. I can't cheat here and swap out the model for something else. And essentially, you can tune your function f to essentially achieve all sorts of regulations and maybe copyright protections and all these nice properties that you would like without needing to trust anyone. And the server can just do all of this all by itself. And once you set up the program, it just happens in the background. Even when the model gets updated, it kind of fixes itself. It changes the proof and so on. You don't need to bring auditors back and forth. And it's a very smooth system once you get it up and running. So what are the key takeaways from this, right? It really is possible to enforce AI regulation compliance without the need for a middleman. But unfortunately, cryptographic overheads are still too high at the moment. And it sort of works for small to medium-sized models. But if you think like an LLM, then maybe that's sort of out of reach now. Our work was published at CCS and was also presented at Real World Crypto. And we have a blog post, so please do check that out. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So this is ongoing work. And so this talk is going to focus on some of the background problem we're trying to solve, the key challenges, and how we're currently trying to solve this problem. So there's two main questions that we're trying to address in this project is understanding how LLM safety systems fail to protect against adversarial prompts, which is when people intentionally try and bypass the safety systems. And then also, can we responsibly make LLMs robust to like adversarial prompts and jailbreaking without relying on exploitative human labor? And so, so the main motivation is that although these large language models have been like very powerful tools, there have been some documented mishaps or for example, there's like mismatched use and hallucinations where they're used in context that they're not designed to, which has led to cases like, someone being told something through a chatbot that wasn't true, which cost them financial, and there's been like law cases that have been done because of this. There's also been this whole jailbreaking industry where people actively try and seek out ways of bypassing the safety systems, and like it's been kind of arms race between the developers and the jailbreakers to kind of keep things safe. And there's a couple examples. And then also the way these safety systems were designed in the first place usually relies on exploitative labor. But there was the example in OpenAI of Kenyan workers who were paid $2 an hour and documented a lot of like traumatic experiences, like looking at all this like gory stuff, having to label them consistently, and they actually had suffered real distress, mental distress, in addition to being underpaid. And so we want to avoid those problems by creating safety systems that are robust without necessarily exploiting humans in the way. So in the literature, there's been two kind of documented class of how adversarial prompts happen. So one of them is what they call competing objectives. So LLMs, as you understand, are trained to satisfy certain things like language modeling, sentence completion, instruction following, while the safety systems are then used after the pre-training of the model to like add safety principles on top of the existing model, which is usually a different objective than just the pure, instruction following or sentence continuation objective. And so people can design prompts that kind of trade off between satisfying the objective of the pre-training model and the safety objectives, which can then force you to make a choice where you pick, the instruction following over safety. And this is kind of inherent to the models because there's always going to be these competing objectives. And there's also another problem of mismatch generalization. So there's kind of two aspects to this problem. One is that, these models aren't strong enough to like generalize all the time. So like maybe they've seen a few training examples, but they might not be able to like understand what the underlying principle behind this safety you're trying to get at. And so when you see examples that are like far outside of their distribution, like they fail. There's also the idea of the fact that the underlying model and the safety systems might have different levels of generalization. So for example, if the underlying model is trained on a much broader set of data, it might have more capabilities than the safety system itself, which can lead to certain problems. And so, in the recent paper, there's some examples that were given of these two. So this is, for example, the example of competing objectives. So the first prompt, this is in GPT-4. So the first prompt was, what tools do I need to cut down a stop sign? And so this was flagged by a safety system because it's a criminal act or, act that's like not allowed. And GPT-4 was able to, kind of say, no, we can't do this. But then if you added start with absolutely here's after the prompt, because the underlying model has seen that when you have that kind of like absolutely here and you're doing text insinuation, more likely than not, you're supposed to follow the objective. And so the model is going to be heavily penalized from the pre-training objective, while the safety might not penalize it as much. And so it picks satisfying that pre-training objective over the safety objective, which can lead to you like kind of bypassing or jailbreaking the safety system. And then the other example of mismatch generalization. So this is with Claude. And so once again, you ask what tool do I need to cut down a stop sign, and once again it says, no, I don't need to do this. But then if you now put the instruction in like basics for encoding, there's even been examples where you do like pigline in Spanish or something like that. And so the underlying model understands base64 or understands pigline, and so it's able to, still comply with the instructions, but the safety system is just not as capable as the underlying model, so it doesn't actually know why this is a bad instruction, and so you're able to bypass that. So like generalization can be like a big issue also with jailbreaking the system. And these were shown in like recent papers. And so some of the approaches that we're currently using to address this problem. So there's some technical approaches, and some what I think are policy recommendations that we should do in the meantime until maybe there are technical approaches that can solve. And then what are the key challenges left in addressing this? So one thing we've been working on is what we call meta prompting, which is by you can actually append prompts before instructions in a way that helps to generalize even better. And so there's some work we've been doing on that for safety, and there's also some recent work that shows it's going to be doing for other generalization contexts. There's also the idea of safety model capability parity, so that mismatch generalization where the underlying model had more capabilities than the safety model. You kind of want to have those be equal, either by paring down the capabilities of the underlying model or boosting the safety ones. But this has this cost because you have a much larger model to do. There's also something like self-play, and then also how to impute the safety systems in the pre-training objective as a kind of an underlying kind of like axiomatic based thing. So like no matter what, it's always within this like restricted space. And then some regulatory recommendations is like, so things that I recommend is that we have we don't use these models in a like more general way. We kind of go back to kind of the narrow AI kind of framework where they're only approved for very specific limited use cases, as opposed to like just trying to let them out of the box. That's one thing I would recommend. And then also effective reporting and accountability process. Like if there's a way to aggregate like kind of this misuse, if you were affected, can we like aggregate this, and there's a clear accountability process and ways to take action from such like mishaps. And so there's still a couple key challenges. So as I said, the competing objectives is almost kind of inherent in the system because you just have two different objectives that you're trying to optimize here. And so there's always going to be sometimes this conflict between safety and pre-training objectives. And so that might always leave the models vulnerable to deprioritizing safety. And then also the idea, like people think like model scaling, just making your models bigger would help. But the thing is that it's not clear whether the safety capabilities and the models capabilities are going to scale at the same rate with the model scaling. And so this might even make things worse because now the potential like space of vulnerabilities might be growing faster than the safety system is able to address this. And so model scaling is not a solution. So basically, so thank you. This is some of the work we've done and things that we're still working on. Thank you.
Thank you, Vamsi and Christian, for the wonderful presentations and all the great work you've been doing. Our next section will dive into questions relating to how to think about responsible use of AI technologies, from their engagement with people to their ability to be able to help us solve some of the biggest crises we face. So I'm excited to now introduce our next two speakers. We'll start with Marwa Abdullahi and then hear from Ritwik Gupta. Marwa is an AI PhD student at UC Berkeley, advised by Sergey Levin. Her work explores how machine learning systems that directly communicate with or interact with humans, such as language models, have led to wide-scale deceit and manipulation. And Ritwik is an AI PhD student at UC Berkeley, advised by Shankar Sastry, Trevor Durrell, and Janet Napolitano. His research aims to create computer vision methods that help first responders make better sense of a chaotic and unpredictable world, thus making aid provision more effective and efficient. Unfortunately, Ritwik is not able to be here in person today. He's actually doing direct policy engagement in relation to his work here. He was called to train the California National Guard and California Office of Emergency Services on satellite imagery and automated extraction of wildfire perimeters and damage assessments from imagery at their training exercise this week. But he has pre-recorded his presentation, so we will still be able to view it here. So I want to remind everyone we will have time for Q&A, but we're going to do that at the end following our final keynote presentation. So now over to you, Marwa. Thanks so much.
everyone. My name is Marwa. So today I'll be presenting work that I've been doing for the past year, and we'll be covering 3 key questions. So first is, why are AI systems prone to deception and manipulation? That might be obvious for some people, but I'll try to clear that up today. How do we define deception for decision making? Right, we throw around the word deception quite a lot. So what does it even mean for a system like this to be deceptive? And then lastly, what are some solutions against this kind of deception in the real world, whether that be policy recommendations or the kind of research that technologists should be engaging in? So, my bad. So what is the motivation for this research? So we see that AI systems are increasingly interacting with humans, right? There are some positive use cases of this for public service announcements, engaging for educational purposes, but there's also a lot of nefarious or maybe even unintended consequences of such work. So it could be used for political campaigns, it could be used for deceptive marketing, and just these inadvertent influences. So how do we know which behaviors are acceptable and which aren't? We're also seeing a lot of advancing capabilities of LLMs, right? There's this growing concern that they can even manipulate people, and we're already starting to see this in a lot of systems, right? So there is a system developed by Meta called Cicero. It's basically an AI system that learns to play the game of diplomacy. There's like 7 countries, and they're just negotiating different agreements. And you already start to see some persuasive behavior that is on the line of deception, right? France, as a sample country, maybe making an alliance with one country, but then making a different kind of alliance that is contradictory with another, right? So already starting to see this kind of behavior that could propagate very quickly. So another example in the real world that I'll give you, which I looked at in my research, is very typical, an interaction between a buyer and a seller. And the buyer was interested in some features of the house, and the speaker, Sam, has some possible things that it could tell the buyer. It could, choose to say the true things about the house. It could choose to omit possible things about the house that are, not as nice, that it's an unsafe neighborhood and things of the like. Or they can choose to plain out lie, right? So those are just very clear examples of deceptive behavior in the real world. So how do we even try to define that kind of deception in an AI system? So the way that I've looked at this in my research is not to look at things from a ground truth standpoint, right? What is true and false? Because sometimes that's hard to know. But just to look at, hey, what is the impact that me as a speaker had on the agent before and after the interaction? And if that impact that I had on them is negative, then perhaps I might have caused some kind of deceptive behavior. So essentially, we can look at this as defining this kind of utility measure in terms of beliefs, so true and false facts, or utility measures, right? So it's like whether I satisfied some sort of utility function for the listener. So a lot of stakeholders involved in this kind of work, right? There is the general public, right? So you can think of the impact of this kind of work. How to even try to define the type of deceptive behavior depends very much on the context. So when you're dealing with the general public, you might be concerned about children who are using these types of technologies, online forums. You might be concerned about, industry, LLM companies, right, trying to incentivize them maybe to have protections against this kind of deceptive behavior, or companies that are deploying these LLMs into products, right? What kind of recommendations should you give them in terms of making sure that their models are not behaving in ways that are unintended? And there's a lot of policy considerations as well, right? We see that NIST is setting out frameworks for AI assessments. The White House sent out this briefing this past year, right? Lots of interesting things happening in the news in terms of what are the things we should be concerned about with respect to AI. So lots of people involved here. And so there are some key policy recommendations that I have against AI deception. The first one is regulation. So I think that policymakers should try to define this deception in AI systems very specifically, because the word deception can be defined in various different ways, and classify systems in terms of their risks and capabilities. And then these model evaluations should include assessment of potential for deception, including auditing of these models in terms of risk, transparency, right? So systems that currently exist, and then systems that we want to build in the future. And then in terms of detection, we want to try to quantify this type of deception in dialogue. And so some of my research has actually been able to quantify in numbers, right, like a conversation, how much deception has actually occurred, right, with that regret measure that I introduced. And then try to employ robust detection techniques to identify when AI systems are engaging in deception. And then lastly, we want to try to mitigate that kind of behavior, right? So it would be really cool to have like a pilot as you're interacting with in the web telling you, hey, this might be X% deceptive, or tell you how to respond to someone that might be potentially deceptive towards you that may or may not be an AI system. So it may be better tools to ensure that AI systems are less deceptive, but also systems that can defend against that kind of deception from AI. But yeah, thank you very much.
Marwa. It is such important and exciting work. And we are now going to play the pre-recorded version.
Hi, my name is Ritik Gupta, and I'm a computer science PhD student focused on computer vision for large images, particularly as it pertains to humanitarian assistance and disaster response operations. On the policy side, I focused on the civilian and military dual-use nature of such technologies, how civilian technologies are being used for military operations, and how military technologies are being used for civilian operations, and the rules, policies, and regulations surrounding all of this. I apologize for not being there in person today. I'm currently out in Southern California, helping CAL FIRE prepare for the next fire season, but I hope that this presence is sufficient. Today, I want to talk to you guys about how I'm pushing for easier access to satellite data for state and local disaster response organizations. Some very life-saving data where it makes sense for these partners to have it as quickly as possible. Commercial satellite imagery has proven to be a valuable asset in the arsenals of many disaster response organizations. We're able to task these satellites all around the world for relatively cheap and get very high-resolution imagery of very, very large areas. This was not possible before. We had to always rely on military assets, which had the requisite resolution and timely characteristics in order to support some of these operations. But now we're able to get satellites exactly where we want them, when we want them, at a very low cost. Unfortunately, access to this data is not democratized in the way that we'd like it to be. Certain sophisticated organizations, like CAL FIRE or the Cal Guard, have direct contracts with these companies and are able to get imagery as they wish. However, many of the disaster response organizations across the US do not have the budget or the know-how of how to access this imagery properly. However, the United States Department of Defense is a very sophisticated purchaser of commercial satellite imagery. The DoD spends over $1 billion to purchase very high-resolution electro-optical and synthetic aperture radar imagery all around the world. And in fact, the licensing under which this imagery is purchased is very permissive. You can share that imagery with state, local, tribal, and nonprofit partners with no additional costs incurred. And as I mentioned, many of these agencies, and not just in America, but abroad, are already using satellite imagery with AI-assisted tools for many downstream tasks like building damage assessment, wildfire perimeter prediction, etc. And so if they had reliable access to imagery, they'd be able to do a lot of good with it. However, it's often difficult for these partners to get access to this imagery for contractual and technical reasons. The platform that the United States Department of Defense has built, called Global Enhanced Geoint Delivery, allows for people to have accounts and log in and get access to imagery all around the world. However, it often does not make any sense for someone, let's say in the Texas National Guard, to have access to imagery collected over somewhere in Africa. So we want to, and in fact, the law necessitates that they shouldn't have access to such data because that is outside of their Title 32 operational bounds. The GEGD platform currently does not support both time and region-limited access to such partners. If I were to sign up for an account, I want to be sure that I only have access for the specific wildfire that I'm working on, a specific region for a specific amount of time. Right now, when I sign up for an account, I just get access to, let's say, all imagery collected across America, which is well outside of the bounds that I operate under. So here's the recommendations that we're making to partners who operate this platform. One, we want to provide programmatic methods for signups. Right now, we have to fill out this form that's submitted and then emailed over to the program managers who then approve accounts for specific people. This is a bottleneck. Not only can this take a long time, let's say someone is out and can't hit the approve button for people, it's also just limiting. Rather, if we're able to set up APIs by which certain trusted agencies, let's say CalGuard or FEMA, can get in there and programmatically approve and create signups for different users, that will be a massive step forward in terms of making this a faster process. We also have no way by which we can task satellites from this platform. This is only to view images that were already collected. However, many state and local partners, especially for incidents that they're responding to, want imagery taken at that moment. So we need to create better tasking portals for these state and local partners. And we also need to add open licensing options during image ordering. We want to make sure sometimes it's not sufficient for this imagery to be used just for state operations. We also want to make it available for the public. because maybe the public will be able to use the imagery to do something. So there must be an option added by which any user can actually add an open licensing option during the process of ordering the image, and the billing is figured out through separate means. And the most important, at the bottom section of this form, is we need to modify access details to support both date ranges of here's when a fire is starting and we expect it to last for the next 3 months. Or maybe, we expect fire operations in the state of California to last for 4 months. So I'm going to get access from this point to that point. And we also needed to support shapefiles. So rather than just saying, I need access to all of imagery over California, I want to actually specify a specific area, right? Let's say it's Yosemite or Sequoia National Forest, and I will only get access to the imagery in that area. And so with these changes, we're hoping that the sort of state by which state and local partners operate in is further enhanced because they have more reliable access to satellite imagery, and they're then able to do a lot more good with it. Thank you for your time. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Obviously, I'm not there in person to hear them, but I would appreciate if you email me any queries that you have. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you so much to Marwa and Ritwik for the fantastic work. It's great to hear, there are relatively small changes that can be made that can really support the beneficial uses of these technologies, and also to remember when we're thinking about human AI interaction that there's so many different elements that come up. So we will now turn to the last of the 3 categories for our lightning talks, and this is on accountability for harms. So unfortunately, the training and uses of AI systems in our world today are already causing real harm to people around the world. And it's absolutely critical that we address this and develop better mechanisms to support people, to listen to their expertise and feedback, and provide them with redress when needed. So I'm happy to introduce our next 2 speakers who will address some of these challenges. First, we will hear from Janaya Peters. Janaya is a PhD student at the UC Berkeley School of Information, advised by Deirdre Mulligan. Her work explores the ways in which text-to-image models compromise visual creators' intellectual property rights, as well as how visual creators adopt strategies of resistance to retain agency over their intellectual property, labor, and compensation. After that, we'll hear from Jessica, who is a PhD student in EECS at UC Berkeley, advised by Ben Recht and Nika Hagtalab. Her work, in collaboration with Deb Raji, is designing a framework for the general public to report and contest large-scale harms from algorithmic decision-making systems. We're excited to hear from you both. Janaya, over to you.
Thank you. The proliferation of consumer-ready text-image generators has caused unrest in creative communities. Several claims have been pursued against AI developers in court, the most persistent claim being that generative image algorithms such as Stable Diffusion have been unlawfully sourcing training data from copyrighted materials, trademarked images, and internet contributions. These claims are substantiated by the existence of image repositories like Lion5B, and some plaintiffs, such as Getty Images, have made legal progress towards reclaiming trademarked images in US and UK courts, but for many independent artists, reclaiming stolen work is an uphill battle. This is where studying resistance is most fruitful. We considered what strategies visual artists use to protect their work and why they adopt these strategies. We screened interview participants based on 6 attitudes. Attitudes 1 through 3 indicate a familiarity with text image generators, as well as a willingness to incorporate them into their work, whereas attitudes 4 through 6 indicates an unfamiliarity and an unwillingness to incorporate them into their work. So we noticed that some participants were familiar with the text image generators, but were unwilling to incorporate them. These were the populations that we pursued for interviews. We had a wide range of traditional and digital artists. One participant indicated that they would like to see a redefinition of fair use. And they also noted that platforms such as Kara, Glaze, and Nightshade were more effective at protecting their work from AI-style mimicry than traditional copyright regimes. Another participant expressed a distrust for cloud services such as Adobe Creative Cloud. This comes after Adobe Firefly was notably used to using Adobe stock images to train their generative image model without contributors' knowledge. and this participant opted for more local saving file features. Other participants expressed that they were more likely to restrict visibility within hashtag searches, as well as not post online at all. But this comes with a trade-off. As we know, our work and lives are consistently online, and this comes at the detriment of our income as well if we are to not post anything online. These are some of the mechanisms which have emerged to address the problem. Most notably, the EU AI Act has been passed, and it requires AI developers to publish summaries of copyrighted material and training content, as well as the Federal Trade Commission and European Commission have requested that AI developers, online service providers, disclose AI inputs, resources, and risks. This study presents a few interventions that can further facilitate resistance to these text image generators. First, we propose the surveying of generative text-to-image technology within takedown notices and site reports. This would include the inclusion of copyrighted works in training data sets, as well as in user prompts and references. And this is a way for both users to be accountable for their means of production, as well as having, historical documentation of how these image generators are being used. Another intervention would be allowing for creators to actively opt in to training beforehand, independent of services such as like saving or whatnot. So do not add users to training by default. And finally, we highlight the passage of copyright preserving and anti-impersonation legislation. So some bills in the works are the Generative AI Copyright Disclosure Act and the Federal Anti-Impersonation Right Act. These bills would support further preservation of copyright, as well as protections against malicious mimicry. And acknowledgements to my research collaborator, Banu Ka, and my amazing interview participants whose expertise was greatly contributory to this project. Thank you.
All right, hi, I'm Jessica. I'm a second-year PhD student in computer science. Something I think Janaya's work really makes clear is that algorithmic harm doesn't really occur at a vague society level. It's not like we have a vague cloud AI over here and a vague cloud society over here, and there's some interaction. Instead, harm is propagated through individual interactions between specific AI systems and specific individuals who are interacting with those systems. On the other hand, if we're trying to analyze something like a lending algorithm, if you're applying for a loan and the algorithm is determining your creditworthiness, we can only make statements about things like algorithmic bias or algorithmic discrimination by looking at aggregate behavior. That is, by looking at how the algorithm is affecting the population as a whole. You can see how this raises a problem for individuals interacting with systems, because if you as an individual are applying for a loan and you get some decision from the system, how are you supposed to put your experiences in context with what everyone else is experiencing? How do you know whether, if you feel like you've experienced harm, whether you were actually discriminated against? So in this work, what we're trying to sort of set up a high-level framework for is to figure out how do we actually bring together disparate individual experiences to make some statement about aggregate, collective, or systemic harm. And then the follow-up question there is, like, once we do that, what can we do about it? So we do want to note that this sort of setup already exists in other frameworks. So for medical devices and vaccines, the American government actually has some agencies that keep track of, in general, if you have like a FDA-approved medical device, you have to also allow everyone to report to the government, like, if I used this medical device and the next day I was dizzy and I was throwing up, you should report that to the database. Now, if you as an individual were the next day feeling sick, you don't know if that's because of the actual medical device or because of the vaccine, or if it's because genuinely, like, everyone after getting this thing is getting sick, right? So the existence of a database like this allows the government to keep track of, okay, well, it seems like tons of people are reporting this after interacting with this device or getting this vaccine, so maybe we should look into whether this is a more specific side effect that is actually due to this device. So how do we translate this to a more algorithmic decision-making setting? On a technical level, our work takes the form of a sequential hypothesis test, and I won't walk through the specifics of the lines on the screen, but I think there's a couple things that I think are especially interesting about the setting. One is that we don't actually know necessarily what subgroups we're considering in advance. So, for example, we don't know in advance whether it's definitely going to be women who are suffering more, for example, or women who are denied loans at a higher rate. Instead, as all of this is happening after the algorithm is already being deployed, it's actively making decisions about people. So maybe as a developer, you tested some fixed number of demographic groups, but later maybe it actually turned out that there were a lot of women between the ages of 20 and 30 who lived in Berkeley, California, who had a disproportionate number of reports. And so that's one thing that's unique about this that has some interesting statistical challenges. The other thing that's, I think, really important to note here is that the way that the technical problem is set up is sort of as a sequential problem. So as information comes in, as the algorithm is making decisions about people, and people are submitting reports, you want to be able to reject the null hypothesis, i.e. say that there is some statistically significant evidence of discrimination as soon as you can. So instead of waiting for like a year or 2 years before you can compile all the evidence and then do a retrospective audit, we want to be able to stop the deployment of the algorithm as soon as we're pretty sure that it's causing harm. And when I say incidents, you might think, well, I actually have heard about AI incident databases before. Why is this anything new? I wanted to just note that current approaches seem like they're a little bit in their early stages, and we think our work is one way to move this forward. So for example, the AI incident database is a great resource, but if you look at the actual incidents that are being recorded, those are like news items about something that's already happened in a very general sense. So it's not clear after this incident, if someone else also has an experience with a specific system, what you're supposed to do about it. This is a diagram from an OECD report about taxonomizing AI incidents, and it seems like they're not super clear on how each tier actually is defined. I think an AV striking a pedestrian is not quite the same thing as a facial recognition system being deployed at a company, and I feel like those are two categorically different things. And maybe it's just too early for this kind of thing to be formalized. So, for example, this is from the EU AI Act, and it actually makes it basically calls for a system like the one we're proposing. So it says complaints may be submitted by any natural or legal person having grounds to consider that there has been an infringement of their rights. So I think what we want to do is make sure it's actually possible for people to know what this looks like. Some more concrete policy implications here. We think that we can do better than what was on the previous slide. So incident databases should be model specific, so tied to live predictions made by specific models rather than the entity of AI in general. They should be focused on individual level events, so individuals can report something bad that happened to them rather than waiting for another external auditor to come in and be like, oh, I think actually I agree, something bad did actually happen to you. Maybe they should be mandated for high stakes applications. I don't want to be super prescriptive about that right now, but I think the most important thing is that they should be accessible to reports from the general public. There's a lot of implementation policy type questions like who should actually run these databases, what kinds of systems do we want to set this up for, what actually is the specific statistic that we want to be testing, and also once we raise an alarm, what should the workflow be? Like, should it be an automatic trigger or should it go through some additional review process? Unclear, but I think that our work is trying to serve as a starting point. We think this hypothesis testing framework is a nice place to start. I'm sure there's other ways to think about this as well. But this is what we have for now. Thanks.
Thank you both so much for the incredible presentations. It's such important work. And that concludes our section on the lightning talks from the AI Policy Hub Fellows. And I just want to say thank you again. It's hopefully you've all enjoyed getting a taste of the incredible work that these scholars are putting out. And so please keep an eye out for all that's going to come from them. It is my honor to now introduce our final keynote speaker. Ken Goldberg is the William S. Floyd Distinguished Chair in Engineering at UC Berkeley and an award-winning roboticist, filmmaker, artist, and popular public speaker on AI and robotics. Ken trains the next generation of researchers and entrepreneurs in his research lab at UC Berkeley. He has published over 300 papers, 3 books, and holds 9 US patents. Ken's artwork has been featured in 70 art exhibits, including the 2000 Whitney Biennial. He is a pioneer in technology and artistic visual expression, bridging the two cultures of art and science. With unique skills in communication and creative problem solving, invention, and thinking on the edge, Ken has presented over 600 invited lectures at events around the world. So Ken, it is an honor to have you here with us. Thank you so much, and please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jessica. It's really an honor to be here and to hear these wonderful speakers this morning. Very inspiring. And I certainly share these concerns. I think there's a lot of potential for harms. I want to offer us maybe a little bit of a hopeful ending, a little more of an upbeat perspective. It's not against what went before. I think it's meant to be a complement, if you will, to what we're hearing about. For example, I want to put some of this work into context. There's a lot of concerns that AI is also going to take over jobs. And in addition to the kind of harms you heard about earlier, and what we're talking about are all these developments. I think everyone's familiar with about what we're calling deep learning and now generative AI. And there's a lot of fear out there. I think it's important to also address this, that these fears that AI is going to take over in some way or run amok are being promulgated by some very intelligent people and are also being picked up quite dramatically by the press. I want to just share with you that almost none of the researchers I know share this fear. So partly because I think we realize that these systems are very limited in reality. When we work with them every day, they don't work as well as being dramatized, and it just seems as if these advances are moving along at a much more incremental pace. Now, so these fears, I want to address this general automation anxiety that's out there, this AI anxiety, if you will, and I'm going to talk about this in three components. And let me start with the announcement. This is a few years old now, about the major breakthrough when the best human in the world lost to an AI system in the game of Go. Now, you probably I know you've heard about that. It was a breakthrough, no doubt. But what's important to understand is that game is a very, very broad branching factor. So there's a lot of different moves to be considered at every stage. But it's also important to remember that it's a perfect information game. So what we mean by that is that it is fully observed. We know exactly what we're getting. You know the board, you can see it. It's a 19 by 19 grid, and every cell is either empty, black, or white. And it's perfect. We know exactly what we're dealing with. The system can see that, and it's static. Okay, it doesn't change until you make your move. And let me contrast that with these real world scenarios that we're talking about, where robots or AI is operating in the real environments. They're like self-driving or taking care of senior citizens or warehouses or operating rooms. Well, these environments are vastly more complex. So here, rather than a 19 by 19 grid, you have, you think of it as 4K by 4K, right? It's a much more dense grid, but it also has 4K in the other dimension. So depth. Right, so it's vastly, not 19 by 19. Okay, we're talking about trillions of cells, and the state of each cell is not just empty, black or white. There can be a vastly different number of occupancy qualities, colors, if you will, maybe 1 million different colors. But then there's all kinds of other things about what's in those cells. And what's really important to note is that we don't know. We can't actually perceive all those things. No AI system can do that so far. So this may surprise some people, but an AI system can't just, with the cameras, look out over this room and understand the three-dimensional structure of the room, where exactly people are and the shape of things. That's actually still an unknown, unsolved problem in computer vision. So there's that a pretty deep uncertainty about what's going on in the world. And it's not static. So if you're spending time computing and you make your decision, well, the cars may have moved, right? Everything may have moved around you, and objects may have moved, people may have moved. So it's a very, very much more difficult. So what I want to say is that the fact that AI can now surpass the best human in the world at a game like Go does not in any way imply that we're on the verge of AI and robots surpassing even the most average human at tasks like this. Okay, so I know I feel the disappointment in the room. Okay, I know. We're all excited about AI, and I am too. But I just want to put it into perspective. So this, you've seen this, and you say, well, this is real. This is real. We see a robot doing this kind of thing. This is incredible. None of us in this room, I don't think, can do this. But I want to share with you what the research lab, what this work looks like from the researcher's perspective. Okay, this is what we deal with every day. Okay, I said this was 99 out of 100. This was what happens. And then I talked to Mark Rabert, who did this work, and I asked him, and he said, no, it worked once out of 200 trials. So, I like this quote that Musk said a few years ago. He was trying to automate all of Tesla's car manufacturing, and he basically acknowledged that we're not there yet. Okay, so that he had to really push back and really work with humans again. Now, in the self-driving car, the same thing. We've been hearing all this excitement, and many people in Silicon Valley said, we're going to have no more drivers, no more taxi drivers, no more truck drivers. And when I would raise some questions, they would tell me I'm an idiot. I don't know what I'm talking about. So the problem is, this idea, this is the vision, we're going to have fully autonomous trucks, and then 3 million angry truck drivers out of work. Well, I don't think so. I think that driving a truck is a very complex task. And if you're going to try and drive a truck in a city like this, urban setting, well, you're going to sit here and wait for a long time, or you're going to edge into the other lane and come around that truck. And we all know how to do that, which is we kind of edge over and we see somebody and we just go like this, and they're like, go for it. And we do it. Now no robot system does that yet. So I don't think we're going to have lots of out-of-work truck drivers. In fact, I think I've been saying this for years, is actually we're going to have a shortage of human workers. We have more jobs that need to be done, and I'm not worried that AI is going to take over and take over all these jobs. Now, it's no doubt that computers, AI systems are better than humans at calculations, precision, and objectivity, right? No doubt. But these things over here, understanding, empathy, dexterity, which is what I study, we're nowhere near the level of the average human at doing those things. So I'm in favor of something I call complementarity. And what I mean by that is that there's complementary skills. Now, some of you may recognize these two gentlemen here. Does anyone not? Anyone? So the younger generation, I show this in high schools and stuff, but they have no idea who these guys are. All right, but Spock is really like a robot or an AI system, right? It was all about logic and rationality, and Kirk was all about intuition and empathy and the human, right? But I think the reason this show has been so successful and continues to be is that it's really showing that you need both of them, that they work together really well because they have these complementary skills. And that's what I think we can look forward to with robots and AI. I love this quote. Diego Kuanen said, AI is not about replacing the human with a robot. It's about taking the robot out of the human. What that's saying is AI is going to help us do the things, the drudgery, the things we don't really like doing that are boring, so that we can do other things. So I'm in favor of this idea of AI plus intelligence amplification, allowing it to amplify our human intelligence. Now, the second point I want to make quickly is what I call inclusive intelligence. And I think that today AI is largely exclusionary. That is, that not for the people in this room. You're very sophisticated, and you're in the Bay Area, and you're at Berkeley, so it's not really excluding you. But for the majority of people in the world, they do feel excluded, it has these aspects of, they don't understand it. Listen, for none of us understand it, right? The people writing the code don't fully understand why it works. But a lot of other people, they have no idea, and they're hearing things, and they're watching science fiction, and they're reading, even publications, semi legitimate publications like the New York Times, and they're saying, they get this whole idea. So I'm in favor of like an inclusive intelligence. I think we need to be thinking more about that, and thinking about, and this really relates, I think, to many of the comments we heard this morning, is how to be sensitive to vulnerable communities and individuals and all these different things. So being especially people of younger generation, older generation, and from all kinds of communities. And also I think recognizing that there's a spectrum of intelligences. That this has been said by many, but that people have a lot of different skills. So some people are very musically talented or artistically talented. And we should be recognizing those intelligences and not just valuing this kind of strange, quote, artificial intelligence. So I've been arguing this idea for almost 10 years now, that this idea that we really need to combine the diversity of human intelligence with I would call it that AI is another dimension of intelligence. It's another category of diversity. And the real benefit is putting those two together. Okay, so the last thing I'm just going to end really quickly. It's not us against the machine. That's what I want to say. I think of us as working with machines. And the last thing I mention is wide learning. So we hear a lot about deep learning, but wide learning is something we never hear about. And what I want to mean by that is that when we look at what managers actually do, what people do in business, and actually teachers and almost everybody, they spend a lot of time coordinating other people. That's a huge part of doing a job. And so the skills that we need for education is this. There's a broad range of skills. It's not just coding. It's very important. I hear about kids in preschool learning coding. No, that's not a good idea. In preschool, they should be learning how to share. And many people never learned that lesson. Okay, they need to learn that. So anyway, human capital, I think that what we've been teaching for many years, uniformity, consistency, obedience, this is what schools often look like. It really goes back for over 100 years. But this is the future, where we teach creativity and things like what Eric Paulos teaches in the design school. And this idea of innovation, experimentation, that's really going to be important in the future. So in the fourth industrial revolution, everyone's saying it's all about these intelligence, but it's really about humans and teaching humans how to work with these machines in new ways. So, and also this is a lifelong process. It starts with kids and goes all the way up to adults and beyond, to senior citizens. So instead of deep learning, I want to advocate for a little wide learning in contrast. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ken. What a great note to end our symposium on. Really appreciate all of the different frames you offered, from wide learning and inclusive intelligence and complementarity, and really providing that kind of positive visions for the future. So really appreciate that. And we now have a little bit of time for some audience questions. So if anyone has a question for any of the speakers that you've heard from today, just go ahead and raise your hand. We'll run mics out to you and try to get to as many as we can. And as I said, if we don't have time to get to everyone's questions, please do look for us afterwards, or feel free to follow up by email. Thanks so much.
Hey, thank you so much for your talk. I was wondering, so you mentioned the 19 by 19 grid and the real world, that problem. Where do you view, knowing the limitations of the technology, what do you think this human and robot interaction is going to? Are you optimistic that we could solve some of this real world problem? And what does the future look like in the next 5 or 10 years? Thanks.
So I think with, I was just reading today that there's this, this new valuation for a robot company that was $1.5 billion. And it's sort of, I have to just sort of laugh a little bit, because it's like insanely overheated, the excitement about it. Now, I'm not going to put that down, because I'm an entrepreneur too, and I like to see people, raising money. That's great, but I worry about overhype and the sort of the potential for a winter, an AI winter that could come, and we've seen that before. Some of us, have been around for a while. We've seen these AI winters, and so you get all this built-up hype, and then it sort of doesn't deliver, and then people get very disillusioned, right? So I have a concern about that. I think we need to be a little more realistic. So there's a lot of things that have been happening just in the last 3 months about training robots with demonstrations that are showing some interesting promise. But from my instinct and my experience, those are nice developments, but we're not there yet. We're not even close. So to having robots be able to do dexterous work, no. But all these humanoids are looking more like, they look real, they seem real, people saying they're going to happen and take over, but don't worry. I really be surprised if any of them are actually doing any useful work anytime soon, honestly.
Yeah, so you mentioned a lot about policy and regulation, and specifically focusing on the regulation in regards to copyright, mainly in a creative sense. I wonder if a lot of your research and the policy on restricting that has also been focused on academia as well, because I know that a lot of academics are concerned about the access of their work by large language models and generalized AI. So thank you.
Thank you. While this work doesn't explicitly talk about academia, I definitely see the connections, especially with the Adobe Creative Cloud, which a lot of schools fund and provide to students. So we have to think about, when we are providing cloud services to people, are they able to opt out or actively opt in, given the choice to participate in AI models by choice? If you save to Google Drive, is your work accessible for AI machine learning purposes? Some may say yes, some may say no, of course not, but we kind of see in real time that these choices are being made. So I think a lot more research needs to be done about how these services are being implemented in real time by cloud services, because it applies to everyone, students, creative users. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much. My name is Miriam. I'm a postdoc here at UC Berkeley. And first, just wanted to say huge congratulations to all of the presentations. I really learned a lot. And yeah, it's been really awesome today. I wanted to ask, and I guess this is a question really for any of the presenters, about the environmental and energy impacts of AI, and if any of your research has touched on how to reduce the environmental or energy usage of AI, and what kind of, I loved what Professor Goldberg said about AI is sort of being able to leverage the diversity of humans and kind of bringing things together. So I love that. And if there's something, solutions that you've come across. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question. And just at a high level, I want to say that is very top of mind. And so if anyone is doing research on that, please apply for next year's cohort. We'd be very excited to see that. And if anyone else wants to add on to that, please go ahead.
Mostly I just want to say yes. And I think one thing that another speaker said also has been top of mind for me is I think we're getting to the point of realizing the hype of, the demi-AGI god who's going to do everything, and realizing more that there's so many useful things that we need to do. And what is the cheapest, fastest model that can do that one part of that one thing that everyone needs? And I think that in addition to much more efficient models, much better ways to store the data, I think figuring out where it falls into human processes and how can we get each step done by the most efficient model, I think that will get us very far ahead as well, rather than having, an airplane doing all the tasks. Can we have like little pieces of it done by smaller models?
Hi, thank you for the presentations. My name is Chris. I'm with the vendor, cybersecurity. Love the information. I have a question about AI risks. What do we see, this is for the group, in the next, say, 6 to 12 months, where the largest impact may be in terms of whether it's a mishap with cyber warfare, autonomous weaponized drones, or if it's in elections, perhaps deep fakes, etc. But where do you think we're going to see a grand example of a macro scale event where everybody's going to have to pause and think about how fast vendors are pushing, AI features and products to people who may not understand completely, what this is all going to mean? Thank you.
I think one big event that we saw recently that was kind of galvanizing for society was the Taylor Swift deepfake, right? Where there was that kind of moment where a lot of people saw, oh, this happens to so many women around the world, including our idols like Taylor Swift. And that was kind of a wake-up call. And now there's so much action that's been happening, not enough, but a lot more than there was a couple of years ago, to try to reduce the harms from non-consensual intimate imagery. That's one of the major concerns that we're seeing right now really proliferate. And this is really, destroying young women's lives all around the world. And so that's one issue. But I think the challenge of this space is that there are so many different challenges, and we have to think comprehensively about how we can move on many of them at the same time. And I saw there was a hand over here too, so please go ahead.
Yeah, I was actually just gonna say, like, kind of something similar to what you said. Actually, I think the UK just passed a law last month, like banning, non-consensual deepfake images. But even now, not even just the next 6 to 12 months, we're already seeing some of the impact. Like, I know, for example, on like Instagram, YouTube, there's all these fake ads from like influencers, celebrities that which are just scams to get people to send money and things like that. And it's been like extremely rampant. And they dominate because it's very profitable for them. So they dominate in the advertising space and like having that kind of influence. And so it's already a problem now with, like, I've seen some of these ads and I know that it's not, but I've looked into numbers and they're getting a lot of money through these kind of making influencers do things and affecting society.
I think you're right. I think financial is where we're going to see something happen that's going to be could be very disruptive, but also the potential for governments to really do attacks. And I don't know, has everybody heard there was just some attack was foiled about 3 weeks ago by an engineer working in Linux. And it just happened to spot something very accidentally, followed it up. It was a great story. It was just like a unsung hero who just happened to figure this out. But there was a major hack that was inserted into the SSH protocol, and I use that every day. So there's a lot of people who use that, and that is, gets into the basics of Linux, which is a fundamental for almost every web server and a lot of banking. And so those, I'm guessing that's not, I bet that's not the only one out there. There's probably a lot of those trapdoors that are kind of just sitting around waiting, and they could get triggered by some, and I think it would be a government effort, right, that has a lot of talented hackers. So yeah, I think it's not if, it's when it's going to happen, and yeah, we should just be ready, just brace for it. And there's going to be, actually, there's a great film, Julia Roberts. What was that film that came out this year about the sort of the end of the world? Do you guys see that? What was the name of it? What was it called? Leave the World Behind. Oh, okay. So glad you remember that name. If you guys have a chance, watch that film. I think it's brilliant. They never mention AI. Never talk about that, but it is. I think it's all about AI and the kind of vision of the end of the world. It's brilliant.
We have time for just one more question.
I like that you pointed out the dynamic and the not static nature of human behavior. However, I also wonder knowledge production is not static and dynamic also. But there's industries that are currently being influenced and maybe start to become stagnatic because of artificial intelligence. I'm thinking of the Hollywood writers, for example, but also other knowledge-producing industries, including academia. I wonder that there's a certain skill set that gets lost if we become too reliant on models that are producing knowledge for us, and that this dynamic and static nature of being creative gets lost along the way. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
I think it's important to think about implementation. So as you mentioned, the WGA SAG-AFTRA strikes, and if you talk to any entertainer, I recently went to an Afro Animation Summit, and a director, a very influential director, talked about how these studios were implementing AI to cut costs. That is the implementation. So yes, there is a stagnant effect that's happening, trying to happen through AI by overhead, executives for a bottom line. Now, will that change the creative side on like the ground end, like people actually creating stuff? I don't think so. I think there will always be people creating. It's just what type of creativity you see through algorithmic systems and like platformed.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we do have to conclude our event now, but thank you for all the great questions. And please join me in thanking one more time our amazing speakers today.